One could say there were no Democrats or Republicans in Congress, just Americans. Yes, there are and will be disagreements, but they are legitimate differences of opinion on how best to reduce government costs, what tax changes will provide incentive to increase productivity, and how best to restore our defense capability. Already the Congress has voted the greatest reduction in the budget ever attempted, and at the same time has mightily increased the spending for the military. The argument, if there is any, will be over which weapons, not whether we should forsake weaponry for treaties and agreements. My good friend Lawrence Bielenson authored a book a few years ago called The Treaty Trap. It was the result of years of research, and it makes plain that no nation that placed its faith in parchment or paper, while at the same time it gave up its protective hardware, ever lasted long enough to write many pages in history. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't seek treaties and understandings and even mutual reduction of strategic weapons. The search for peace must go on, but we have a better chance of finding it if we maintain our strength while we're searching. Mr. Bielenson has recently authored a new thought-provoking book called Survival and Peace in the Nuclear Age. But weaponry alone does not mean security. General George Patton said, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and of the man who leads that gains the victory." Now today we seek only to make one change in that statement. It is the men and women who follow and the men and women who lead. Now, I meant to ask the general before I got up here, and I forgot to do it, because I've been given two figures. I know that there are either 58 or 68 women in this graduating class, and I do know that women constitute more than 9% of the Army today. The indispensable factor for protection for all that we hold dear is leadership. The leadership of you and young men and women like you that you offer to this nation. You will be the individuals who most inspire and lead those who are called upon to do the hard and sometimes thankless job. There's a writer, James Warner Bella, sometimes called our Rudyard Kipling because of his stories of our Army on the frontier as we pushed westward. And in one of his stories, he described a poignant scene. A commanding officer lay dying on the field of battle. As he passed the command to a younger officer, he said, "There may be only one time in your life when your country will call upon you, and you will be the only one who can do the nasty job that has to be done. Do it, or forever after, there will be the taste of ashes in your mouth." A torch of leadership is being handed to you in this commencement ceremony today, a ceremony that in all this land is duplicated only in the several other service academies. I know that you've learned the principles of leadership here in this historic place. You know that it requires one to command respect of those who follow by deserving that respect, by dedication and total commitment to the defense of our country and all that it represents. You've had an excellent example to follow. Pastor, who is, I know, an honorary member of your graduating class now. He arrived as superintendent almost at the same time as you enrolled as plebes, and he retires now as you graduate. He served his country well, retired as a 4-star general, but was willing to leave retirement and give up a star to return to West Point. You're part of a great tradition. It's overused, I know, but the term, the long gray line, is descriptive of the tradition of which you are now a part. In that line have been men In that line have been men who turned defeat into victory, who stood in the breach till citizen armies could be raised. For a time, West Point was the nation's principal source of professionally trained engineers. The West was explored and mapped by members of the Long Gray Line. A West Point graduate helped design the Panama Canal and the Howard Tunnel. 2 were presidents. 2 are presently cabinet members in this administration. Others have been giants of commerce and industry: Henry DuPont, class of 1833, Robert E. Wood, class of 1900. Dwight Eisenhower said, even in the event of a complete disarmament, there is a role for West Point. Even if we just turned our graduates back into the body politic, it would be good. The graduates are trained people who understand their duty and who do it. 6 of the astronauts were graduates of West Point. Among them, the first man to walk in space, Colonel Edward White, who then lost his life in 1967 in a tragic fire that swept the Apollo spacecraft. But let us look ahead to the force of which you will be an important and significant part. I doubt there will be many surprises because, in a way, you've been Army for the last 4 years. There's little chance that you will be like that recruit in World War II who asked in some bewilderment why the Army did certain things in the way it did. And a long-time regular Army sergeant said, well, let me explain it to you, son. If you were in charge of a brand new country and creating an army for that country, you finally got a division organized, what would you call it? And the recruit said, well, I guess I'd call it the 1st Division. Well, he said, in the United States Army, when they did that, they called it the 2nd Division. And he said, when you understand that, you'll know everything about the Army and why it does things that way. But our country has a unique tradition among the nations. Unlike the other powers with armies of conscripts, our military was always composed of citizen volunteers. In times past, the standing army was a skeleton force that expanded in wartime to absorb the draftees, the conscripts. We also counted on a National Guard, a trained reserve to bridge the period when the draftees were undergoing basic training. We must still have that reserve, and we're taking steps to upgrade it to a state of immediate readiness. We once had the luxury of time provided by the 2 great oceans, a luxury we no longer have. At the end of World War II, we continued the draft into peacetime, even though the peacetime draft was counter to American tradition. We had always believed that only in the most severe national emergency did a government have a claim to mandatory service of its younger citizens. But we returned to that tradition in 1973, a volunteer military. Some proclaimed it a failure from the start. I'm not going to take your time by reciting the pros and cons of the debate which still goes on, except to say that some expressed the belief that patriotism alone should be cause enough to serve. Well, George Washington, to quote him again, once said of patriotism, "It must be aided by a prospect of interest or some reward. For a time, it may of itself push men to action.